Hello, and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And in our 19th episode, we will be talking about the new Marvel Cinematic Universe film, Doctor Strange, and the new Doctor Who spin-off, Class, with guest blogger Julianne Benford to talk about the YA aspects of it all. We'll then be talking about the new Ken Loach movie, I, Daniel Blake, and finally we'll be seeing what Alastair thought of the anarchic cartoon Rick and Morty, which I recommended him last time. But before all that, Alastair, what have you been up to since the last episode?
Well, I've been cheating on this podcast with another podcast.
Wow.
In that last night, I went to a live version of Welcome to Night Vale, which has got strong competition to be probably the most famous podcast on the planet. It's a big institution in geek culture. It's a really great horror comedy podcast, in case the three people in the world who aren't aware of Welcome to Night Vale are listening to our podcast.
Certainly in the sort of geek trope pop culture sphere, which I suspect does cover a lot of the people who might listen to this, they're probably aware of Night Vale. Yeah, I reckon there's a decent chance, at least aware of it.
So Welcome to Night Vale are doing a live tour, in that they're doing kind of their podcast, a live version of their podcast, and last night they were at the London Palladium. They said it was their second biggest show they've ever done, and it was a big West End theatre that was sold out. And it was excellent. We got to see all the people in the flesh. Cecil Baldwin, the creators of Welcome to Night Vale, Jeffrey Kramer and Joseph Fink were both playing parts, so we got to see them in the flesh, as well as a host of other voice actors who play parts in the show were all there. And there was live music from Disparition, who does the music from the show. They had the weather section of the podcast done live. Can't remember off the top of my head who the woman was.
Eliza Rickman,
yes, doing the weather live. She was really good, melodic, slightly haunting, slightly electronic, folky stuff, so that was really cool. It was classic Night Vale. It was at times hilarious, at times slightly irreverent, at times really creepy and strange and quite scary, and at times kind of very emotional and sort of uplifting. So yeah, it was a great night out.
Yeah, I stress the reason I don't mind Alastair cheating on our podcast is because I was also there. Yeah, I'm probably not going to review this at length because I think people who don't like Night Vale won't care, and people who do like Night Vale probably don't want us to tell them what happens in the live show. They've been doing the main podcast for nearly 100 episodes now, and they've very much got their rhythm and their tropes and what they're about down, so they can just turn up and rattle it off, and it looks like they're having fun, and it has a lot of energy, and the creators came out, and it's all very knowing wink wink for the fans, and, you know, for those who aren't fan enough to recognise that it's the creators, they are also perfectly good voice actors. So yeah, it was a really strong show. It was funny all the way through, it was creepy and unsettling at the right bits, and then there was the emotional kick at the end, which is another big Night Vale thing, which is, I think, one reason why it's so big among the sort of younger Tumblr using millennial audience. It's the sort of combination of creepy horror tropes and genuine emotional feels is, I think, very much hitting a lot of their interests in one fell swoop. So yeah, Night Vale, yeah, it's a machine at this point. It's a massive machine, but it's a machine that's actually still producing good material in its vein, so it's fine. You can't resent them too much.
One of the great things about Night Vale, and I think one of the reasons why it's resonating with geek culture so well, is that it's really good on diversity. Like, there's a great range of representation of like LGBT characters. There's just great diversity in like the cast and the characters they have. I want to steal an excellent point that I overheard the person sitting behind me said. So, person sat behind me, if you are listening, thanks for a great opinion. But they said it kind of reminds them very much of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but it's kind of updated sort of queer culture to be more modern, in that when the Rocky Horror Picture Show film came out, it was very like being in your face and provocative as a kind of statement of like, we are here, you can't ignore us. Whereas now diversity is more about like LGBT people are just like everyone else, and we're all part of one humanity, and it's done in a sort of more subtle way. And I think that's a really good point, because they both Rocky Horror and Welcome to Night Vale have this blending of kind of diversity and LGBTQ representation with like a kind of science fiction horror element, and comparing the two is an interesting way to show how diversity has changed over the last sort of 30 years.
That is a good point. My congratulations to the person sitting behind you. But yes, that wasn't even the only live podcast events that one of us went to this week. I also went to the live recording of Silence, episode 200, or Silence, to give it its proper pronunciation. And this is a comics podcast which you can get on mindlessones.com, and if you're interested in, you know, people talking about comics and just comics for, well, okay, mostly comics, for an hour and a half at a time. It is one of my favourite comic shows on the internet, and I do say this as someone who has listened to a lot of them. That it's presented by Gary Lactus and the Beast Must Die, who are comic creators themselves, sort of indie comic creators, and do have a lot of interesting insights in comics, and also very funny, and occasionally very endearingly shambolic, which was very much borne out in the 200th episode recording, which was just 12 guys, and it has to be said, it was 12 guys, sat around the table in a pub, just sort of talking across the microphone. So yeah, you can listen to the Silence 200 recording, which is up now on mindlessones.com. You can hear me talking briefly about Sonic the Comic, which I read when I was 10, and singing the Reviewniverse song, which is every bit as good as it sounds. It's a good time. I recommend it.
First up, we will be discussing Doctor Strange, the 14th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Bloody hell.
Dr. Stephen Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, is a brilliant neurosurgeon at a top New York hospital. Following a car crash, he develops a tremor in his hands and is unable to carry on working. In trying to find a way to heal himself, Strange travels to Tibet, where he meets a group of monks who protect the world from threats from other dimensions. Strange tries to learn their magic and some humility, while defending himself from Kai Silius, played by Mads Mikkelsen, a fellow monk who's gone mad with power. So this is the last superhero movie of 2016. It's been a mixed year for comic book movies, superhero movies, comic book adaptations. So Nick, how do you think it measured up to the other comic book movies of the year?
Fairly well. I think I'll get into, ranking your favourites later, but just in terms of this film, it was actually good fun. It was good, it was never not watchable. Hard to ignore the fact that the Marvel origin film is becoming a bit of a template, and in a lot of ways this didn't really escape that template. But at the same time, it's a template they can do quite well, and I think this film brought a bit more that was unique or different or interesting to it. I think it was probably a more interesting example of that than, say, Ant-Man, which, although it was very fun and very sort of aggressively competent, I did feel a bit standard Marvel film, whereas this, although a lot of elements of it were a bit standard, I think it had a certain look and feel that were at least a little unique. The director, Scott Derrickson, made an effort to give it this sort of slightly subdued, not exactly horror-y, but maybe a bit more gritty and a bit less bright and larger than life than some of the recent Marvel films have been. I was always entertained. I was aware that it wasn't really changing my life or elevating the form, but after we have, as you say, had some formulaic comic films that have been both formulaic and shit this year, the fact that this was maybe a bit formulaic but still quite good and well executed still puts it towards the top of the list, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it was a bad film. I don't think it was an amazingly good film. It was a good film, but it wasn't. And it wasn't terrible, and it wasn't knock it out of the park brilliant. The visuals were really, really good. I think the one place where the film really excelled is in how beautiful it was to look at. It was a true, cinematic experience. In fact, I kind of felt I probably lost out on something not seeing it in IMAX in 3D, just seeing it in a regular cinema. I mean, they had several really spectacular action scenes. There was they travelled to a thing called the mirror dimension, which is a kind of Inception-like space where they can sort of bend reality and shape reality, and there's a big fight sequence that takes place in the middle of the film that's just really spectacular as they kind of run up the sides of skyscrapers and bend skyscrapers over on top of other skyscrapers so they can fall from one to the other. It really plays with your sense of space and your sort of your sense of perception.
Yeah. And I'll take this brief pause to say spoilers, obviously. There will be spoilers. In fact, since we have a peek behind the curtain already recorded the rest of this episode, I will say here firmly that there are spoilers for the things we're talking about in pretty much every segment of this podcast, except maybe the last one with Rick and Morty. So if you're planning on seeing Doctor Strange, Class, or I, Daniel Blake, and you don't want to do so having been in any way spoilt, I would recommend doing so before listening to our podcast. Anyway, back to Doctor Strange specifically. Yeah, the visuals were definitely, of all the things that this film had that elevated it above sort of standard superhero film, the visuals were definitely the big one. I think I've seen people point out that they are drawing quite a lot on the original comics by Steve Ditko, who did enjoy the sort of the weird and the abstract and the cool, impressive visual representation of these magic dimensions, and there's definitely some of that going on. It's one of my big sort of trepidations, I guess, going into this film is, as a sci-fi fantasy fan, I've seen a lot of stories and films and TV that are basically about magic people fighting using magic spells or magic powers or whatever. Yeah, the representations of them have got a bit boring sometimes. There's quite a lot of hand-wavy magic bolts and zapping and people just winning the final battle by just staring angrily at each other until someone just cries and gives up.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of that this year. I felt that if you listen back to our review of X-Men Apocalypse, we said that film has a lot of just kind of people striking a pose, shooting powers at each other, having a very stern expression on their face, and then eventually one person has a sterner expression and they win.
Doctor Strange, as a property which concerns itself primarily with zappy magic bolts and stuff, and also, in fact, much like X-Men Apocalypse, does deal also with astral forms and people projecting their minds or souls out of their body, was a fairly big candidate to go that way. But I'm assuming the director, Scott Derrickson, or some people somewhere in the Marvel machine must share my opinion, because I think the one thing they were clearly trying to do throughout this film was make the magic very, very tangible. There was actually very little throwing magic bolts at each other. It was very, very centred on the magicians or wizards or whatever manipulating the world around them, bringing the buildings around, sending them breaking into different pieces, throwing people magically from place to place, going through these psychedelic landscapes that were mostly made up of recognisable things, and actually quite a noticeable lack of generic swirling energy or something. There was a bit of sort of fighting with like staffs made out of energy they'd summoned up from their hands, but even that was very sort of clunking and actually physical. Yeah,
I'd certainly agree with that. I felt that the magic seemed very practical and not abstract. Sometimes in a lot of fantasy things, the magic can, two things, it can either seem like incredibly sort of theoretical, strange and abstract, partly because magic is a difficult thing to sort of accurately and impressively sort of realise in films. So the magic can seem kind of abstract, or you can get to a point when basically the magic doesn't seem to have any rules or constraints. So the wizard can basically do anything, which makes you sometimes wonder why there's a story at all. I think Warcraft very much fell into that point. Wizards would move their hands and then pretty much anything they wanted would just happen. So what I felt was really good about this film is that the magic that the Doctor Strange and the monks and the villains and stuff were using was very practical in nature. Like, they used it to do things like to make swords or shields or doorways, things you could use. And even if they were hitting, a magic sword against a magic shield, you could kind of sort of understand what was going on.
The general look and the approach they take into the magic and stuff, that was definitely the big appeal for me. It was, it was a fairly brisk plot. I mean, I didn't actually look up the running time, but it was about 2 hours, wasn't it? Or it was only a shade over 2 hours.
It didn't seem too long. It certainly didn't drag in any way. I don't think it had bad pacing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the one upside of it following, in some ways, a slightly general superhero origin template is that, it always had something to do at every point. It didn't really... Yeah, there was a very clear momentum. There wasn't that much sort of just hanging out sequences. It was a very ongoing, sort of propelling plot, and the characters kept coming. Everyone was quite well-defined in themselves. In fact, quite a lot of characters for this sort of film.
Yeah, it did have quite a large cast.
As a result of which, some of whom I guess get a bit underserved. At some point, I'm going to have to talk about Caecilius the villain and poor Mads Mikkelsen, who obviously I love because he was Hannibal, but does not get that much to do in this film. Because the film, in this case, exists to introduce the hero, the villain is a bit superfluous and throwaway. They're just there to give them something to kick against during their first outing. And, in fact, to be honest, even in the big finale, he's just relegated to a flunky of a big special effect. So, alas, poor Caecilius. I love Mads Mikkelsen, and he did deliver his lines about death and a few one-liners and speeches and shouting with a lot of relish. I don't know him well enough to know if he was enjoying himself, but he certainly put his all into what was a relatively small part. Considering people do talk a lot about the slightly thin villains of Marvel films, this was definitely another slightly thin villain in a Marvel film. Yeah,
I thought you're right that Mads Mikkelsen was very good. He had a sort of a degree of campness that works really well in a villain. In a film that, sort of teeters on the line of silly and serious, he kind of, again, did a quite good villain who kind of sometimes could be scary and threatening and sometimes could be quite silly and camp. The villain had quite good motivation. Yuki was sort of relatable. He didn't seem like someone who was like maniacal for the sake of being maniacal.
I agree with that up to a point. He was just kind of just a villain.
Yeah, he was.
He had more motivation than just, well, haha, I'm so evil, but only barely. There was a bit of a speech about immortality, which is basically just, I'm a selfish villain who wants eternal life. But it wasn't deep characterization.
Yeah. I thought Tilda Swinton... Well, again, much like the Mads Mikkelsen, she played the Ancient One, who's sort of the mentor figure who teaches magic to Benedict Cumberbatch's Doctor Strange. I thought Tilda Swinton was very good. She's a very good actress. And again, but like Mads Mikkelsen, sort of made the best of what was quite a thin part. It was a quite, stereotypical sort of ancient wise magic mentor figure. She did her best with it, and I thought it was interesting to have it sort of a woman in this role when it's usually reserved for men. Though, I know, there's various things I didn't particularly like about her character. I thought she had some really clunky dialogue. One of the things I didn't like about this film is there's quite a bit of clunky, not particularly realistic dialogue in it, in which people talk about power, magic, belief. You know, there's a lot of sort of fantasy movie cliches about having power and belief and seeing the world, you know, in a certain way. It's fairly standard fantasy stuff. There's quite a lot of cliche dialogue. And I guess there's kind of a major turning point in the middle of the film when her character dies. Again, spoilers, people.
Much like Doctor Strange's spellbooks. Spoilers. Yeah. Alastair to give us the warning after the spoiler.
Yep, it's in keeping with the film. But when she died, I really felt it lacked the emotional punch. It didn't quite ring home. You know, I didn't have a sense of like, oh man, things are getting serious now. You know, the villains have killed the mentor figure, which is kind of what you're heading for. I mean, it's part of my criticisms that even when I was watching the film, I felt it was a bit hollow and lacking emotions. It had great special effects. It had an entertaining plot. It had charismatic actors acting well. It just kind of lacked some soul.
I mean, I'm not a massive Doctor Strange fan. I know I usually try and talk enthusiastically about the comics on these podcasts, but I haven't read that many Doctor Strange comics, and the ones I have read, he's just sort of the bloke who turns up and explains magic to Spider-Man or something. I did try and read a couple of the current Doctor Strange comic, which is written by Jason Aaron and drawn by Chris Bachalo. I do usually really like Jason Aaron. He's actually done some of my favourite comics of the last few years. His run on Wolverine and the X-Men, if anyone's taking comics recommendations, is possibly one of the best X-Men comics in years. But anyway, even he did not manage to make Doctor Strange massively work for me. He made it seem sort of fun and weird, but the character never felt particularly developed and like he had big stakes or cared or had anything we should massively care about, and that was kind of true of this film as well. To be honest, it was a fun exercise in running through the plot, and they did have enough style and enough memento and enough good acting to stop it ever feeling like a drag, but I can't say there were that many parts where I massively got invested or emoted or cared.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's a sort of a common problem I get with certain fantasy stories, especially fantasy films. I mean, we were saying before, I think it did a good job of avoiding some of the obvious traps for fantasy films, you know, like saying just it kind of the magic being a bit too abstract. But I do think it fell into some of the other pits of fantasy films in that it was kind of too much about the magic, not enough about the characters. It lacked a kind of a soul. Considering this is a film about, you know, sort of focusing on your soul and yourself is more important than whatever flashy trappings of the modern world you have, which is kind of the character journey for Doctor Strange. This is a film that is very flashy and quite empty. It's very much like Doctor Strange before he discovers the spiritual life rather than after. It's just quite light on characters in places. There was Rachel McAdams played Doctor Strange's sort of ex-girlfriend from the hospital before he becomes a magic monk. And again, her character just was sort of not really particularly developed and didn't really have a resolution to her plot.
I do kind of want to give him a pat on the head for not doing anything too obviously boring superhero love interesty with that character. You know, her love didn't save him. He wasn't redeemed by her love. He didn't win her love at the end. She was just a sort of supportive ex-girlfriend presence. Yeah, they've managed to not do something that's getting a bit predictable and boring, so I guess points for swerving away from the formula. As you say, they haven't really replaced it with anything that substantial, which does leave the film perhaps, feeling a bit cold and unemotional.
Yeah, or just more empty spectacle. I mean, it wasn't as much empty spectacle as, say, you know, Warcraft or Suicide Squad. I mean, it did have characters that were entertaining. It had a plot that never got dull. But the film really was, I think, very much mainly spectacle for me.
I don't know. I'm reluctant to call it empty spectacle because I've sat through Transformers films or indeed Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, but I'm literally sitting there thinking, these special effects are crashing against each other and I do not care. And at no point did I come close to feeling that of Doctor Strange, so I feel a bit bad putting it in anywhere near that pot.
No, I think you're right, actually, yeah. It's got more than just spectacle. And like I say, it's got some decent performances and some entertaining characters, but it lacks something to really transcend.
It doesn't transcend, no. I mean, I don't know what the best... I guess, you know, we've been talking for a few minutes now, we can probably get into comparisons. Other Marvel films that have done similar, sort of trying to launch these sort of B-C-list characters. Obviously, the model, the big success in this vein was Guardians of the Galaxy, which did take a completely unknown property and make everyone love them. Yeah. And the most recent example, I guess, is Ant-Man. Do you think this did a better job than Ant-Man?
I think I preferred Ant-Man. I think some things Doctor Strange did very well that Ant-Man didn't do well, and I think Ant-Man did some things well that Doctor Strange didn't do well. I think Ant-Man I found kind of just came together. It had because it had this kind of family story at the core of it, which in some ways was a bit problematic. You know, that Ant-Man is kind of the stalkery ex, And yeah, he's also the hero. But I felt they did have this kind of core sort of family drama, and also with his relationship to the Michael Douglas character, the original creator of Ant-Man. There was a kind of character emotional core to the film that kind of sustained it better, which Doctor Strange didn't have. But Doctor Strange did do more in breaking the mold, as you said.
Yeah, I think Doctor Strange, I think Doctor Strange is a more interesting film, but Ant-Man, it did do some. I mean, some sort of, in some ways, quite conventional Hollywood power of love, power of family stuff, but still, it does.
Yeah.
There's an extent to which it's a cliche because it works. It does leave you feeling more involved and invested in the character. Whereas Doctor Strange, he was a fun character to spend time with, but I was never that tied up in his fate.
I think Doctor Strange aspired to do more and be a bit different. Like Guardians of the Galaxy was different, but it sort of didn't hit what it was aiming for. Ant-Man kind of shot relatively low just to kind of be, a bit better than another superhero movie, and it kind of exceeded. So it depends. Do you reward ambition or do you reward kind of achieving what you set out? I mean, they're good and bad in different ways.
Well, when you're making this many damn films, you can afford to have them doing different things, I suppose. I mean, I know there are somewhat legitimate criticisms of this film for being, Marvel making another white solo male origin film when they could have made something more interesting, or for the fact that Doctor Strange is, along with Iron Fist, one of these Marvel characters who is a bit culturally appropriative in that it's about a white guy going to another culture, learning their craft and being the best at it.
Yeah, there is a lot of cultural appropriation in this film.
Yes, and yeah, it is just a good film. It's not a great film, so I can't pretend that this is an amazing enough piece of substantial art to justify any things that it's done that are offensive. It probably isn't.
I think one of the reasons why the Marvel films have done well this year, and some of the Marvel-based properties like Deadpool, is the main thing that sustained them pretty much since they set up shop independently with their original Iron Man movies, is that it does have like a sense of humour about itself, and it does sort of not take itself too seriously. I think this film, if they tried to take it seriously, like completely 100% sort of honestly, it would have sort of failed in the way that like Batman v Superman failed. There's a degree to which it's really hard to take this too seriously, and in its moments when it tried really hard to be serious, like the kind of the death of the Ancient One character, it did kind of fall a bit flat. And in some of the kind of more introspective scenes about Doctor Strange and how he was such an egotist before he had his accident, again, it does fall a bit flat. But where it does really sort of stand out is in kind of really going with the fantasy magic, impressive visuals, but also having a genuine sense of humour. Mads Mikkelsen as the villain had a few witty one-liners. There's a magic cloak that's quite funny.
And Strange's sort of back and forth with the librarian Wong is good for a few jokes.
Yeah, played by Benedict Wong, former star of many British BBC shows, now massive in America, as he's been in The Martian and in Doctor Strange and in some other big films.
Good for him.
Those little moments of humour, I think, really did help me kind of, enjoy it a lot more. I felt that, like, some bits I thought this thing is really taking itself too seriously. There were a few times that even as that thought occurred to me, something funny would happen, and I instantly think, oh, actually, no, it doesn't take itself too seriously. Look, it's got a sense of humour. It's fine.
I mean, yeah, this is kind of what I meant when I said earlier that it does go along well. Usually, whenever it's threatening to have a long stretch of this is deadly serious, or a long bit where it seems to be largely slapstick, you then get a bit at the other end of the scale to remind you that, hey, we've got a sense of humour, but there's also the end of the world. And another thing, actually, I did like about this, in terms of it breaking the formula and being interesting, was the ending, like the actual final showdown between Doctor Strange and the big special effects, which I thought was actually quite good. I mean, it avoided the sort of energy blast problem we've complained about. It avoided the here's a massive fight scene which kind of lacks any actual weight we've also complained about before. And yeah, I thought it was an enjoyable sort of actual solution to the problem at a surprisingly small scale.
Yeah, I thought it was very clever, actually. It was one of the best bits of the film when Doctor Strange basically tricks the villain. It doesn't feel like pulling a rabbit out of the hat at the last minute. It very much uses magic and spells that have been set up throughout the film and that you know how they work, and he uses those. Which again, fantasy things can end with either I've just found a new spell and I've cast it and everything's been resolved, or kind of I'm just going to use a spell I've used before, but for some reason it like resolves everything. Whereas this actually, you're aware of what his Doctor Strange's capabilities were, and then you kind of see how he uses them to trick the villain. So I really thought that was quite one of the cleverer, better bits of the film.
Yeah, and again, the sort of the final showdown between Doctor Strange and extra-dimensional evil could have been the boring, stodgy bit, but because they're, again, clever enough to be aware of that, there is a sort of a bit of humour into it as well. There's a bit of fun, cartoonish Bugs Bunny action amid the actual conclusion. It's good.
Before that, there's a very good fight sequence when Doctor Strange faces off against Caecilius, and while he's using his magic to rebuild everything that Caecilius has destroyed, time's running backwards. Caecilius and Strange are outside time, so they're fighting. And it is quite good to see people dodging, say, like a building putting itself back together, because there are a lot of films that end with hero fighting villain whilst everything explodes or collapses around them. It was refreshing to see them hero fights villain while everything puts itself back together.
Yeah, maybe that was a clever bit of commentary on other superhero films. Maybe not, but either way, it was fun. And that is us and superhero films signed off for the year. Wow.
You're just going to look forward to about the 80 or so superhero films that are coming out next year.
Yeah, next year there's a fuck ton. I can't remember what the first one is. It's probably either Guardians 2 or Wonder Woman, but either way, I'm excited. Okay, and next we're going to be talking about Class, the new Doctor Who spin-off, a show run by YA author Patrick Ness. It's our first Doctor Who material since we started the podcast. Yes, despite both being quite big Doctor Who fans, we started our pop culture podcast in what's probably the least Doctor Who year in about a decade since the show came back, so I think you'll agree. Well done, guys. Anyway, Class is a series set at Coal Hill, the school that has been in Doctor Who since the beginning and was particularly a focus in Series 8 when Clara was teaching there. It features a bunch of students and one sort of teacher who investigate weird goings on, but the Doctor is just too busy to deal with himself. So today, for this very special segment, we're joined by booktuber, blogger and YA fan Julianne Benford. Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's good. I'm excited to finally be on this podcast after months of hearing you recording it through the wall.
Yeah, full disclosure, Julianne is also my girlfriend, partner, cohabiting person, so this was not the hardest guest appearance to book. Okay, so, since you're the guest, Julianne, you can go first. What did you think of Class?
I quite liked it. I have a bit of a sceptical approach to all things Doctor Who. I wouldn't really describe myself as a massive fan. You know, I watch it, I quite enjoy it, but I don't get very involved in it. I have watched all the spin-offs since it returned.
Yeah.
So I was looking forward to this one. And I thought the first episode was a bit too actiony. It was kind of introduced the characters at the same time as being very, very fast paced. And I kind of was a bit like, whoa, okay, are we ever going to actually get to know these people? But then the second episode was a lot better. And so I'm feeling quite optimistic about where this is going.
Well, based on the second episode, it looks like they're basically doing the Doctor Who version of Buffy.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, if you do it well, it's hard to complain about it. I quite like Buffy. Alastair, what did you think?
I agree what you're saying, that the second episode was better. I think the first episode suffered from a few of the problems that first episodes in general have. So I don't think it's specifically a problem with Class. I think it's a problem just generally with first intros, why a lot of shows do like double length or two-part first stories. Because your first episode, you've got to set up the characters, you've got to introduce the premise, you've got to tell some kind of story to hook the audience in. And also with like a sort of fantasy stroke sci-fi show, you have to set up like what the kind of fantasy sci-fi dynamic is. And that's a lot of stuff to do in, about 50 minutes. So, the first episode did strain under that weight. It could have probably benefited of opening with a two-parter, so that they had more time to tell like a good story in the first episode. But considering all those things, it was entertaining. It hooked me. It dragged me in. There was some bits in the first episode, some quite clunky exposition, which I wasn't a fan of. But I guess they got to get through all that stuff to establish the premise. So at least they got it out of the way. And then, as you said, like the second episode was better as it sort of contained quite a good sort of mystery and character-focused story.
Yeah, that bit in the prom decoration scene where, as far as I can see, the prince and the angry teacher just explains the plot to that kid.
Yeah.
I felt like I was really receiving exposition in that moment. That was a bit, I really was a bit of a sort of, I am very aware that this is the plot dump.
Which is strange because I think a lot of those details could have waited. I mean, they could have just been like, he could have just added some mystery with him going, I came from a world that was killed by shadows. And then, like, maybe leave it a bit to find out what the deal with that world is. Like, no, we're going to have a 5-minute tangent when we just go through the history of this world, its people, and all its conflicts.
It kind of would have been a bit of a cliche, though, had he actually just gone, oh, I come from a world that was destroyed by shadows.
Yeah, because Doctor Who would never resort to cliche.
Yeah, but it's a bit corny.
It would have been, I suppose, yeah.
It would have been a bit. I mean, I think there was probably some degree of balance to be struck between telling us enough to understand the plot in a reasonable way and not delivering a lecture that included the planet's entire class system or whatever the hell.
Yeah.
Which is what they ended up doing.
Well, I guess they had the problem is that one of the central dynamics of the show is that so the alien prince who's disguise himself as a human.
Spoilers, by the way. We're going to spoil it. It's what we do.
The alien sort of prince is called Charlie. He's got sort of a bodyguard protector who was like a kind of an enemy of his regime. And her punishment for like rebelling against his regime is she has to like protect him now and keep him alive. But then after all that stuff, their world was then destroyed by shadows. That's probably why that scene was so clunky in the exposition, because they had to set up the political tensions that the world had between these two factions, which represented by the two different characters, the prince and his bodyguard. But they also had to introduce the fact that the world was consumed and destroyed by these shadow creatures. And it was kind of like, that's a lot of exposition to get through two key points. I kind of felt that if you're going to give us an exposition, kind of choose one thing to explain, then the audience will get that. Then later you can go to the other one.
Well, yeah, all you had to really know, I guess, was that she's protecting the prince somewhat against her will, and that, is that it really? She has a gun that kills the shooter as well as the victim. And there's the thing where the prince and one of the kids swap hearts, which to this day I still don't entirely understand why that happened as a result of the explained mechanics, but okay.
I'm in two minds about this one, because I think, yes, they could have left that information till later to make the whole first episode run a bit smoother. But then because the teacher, Miss Quill, is so belligerent, because she's so sarcastic and always commenting on everything that's going on, it kind of needed to be explained, because if it's just she's his protector and she's very grumpy about it, there's quite a big mystery there. So maybe they wanted to explain that straight away so we'd know why she was so bitter and always making these little snide remarks.
I liked it in the second episode where they just started playing her for laughs.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's probably the best character.
She's certainly the obvious scene-stealing character, the sort of, I don't really want to be there, I'm going to be snarky about it character. To call back to the Buffy comparisons, she's basically what Spike ended up doing, and I guess before that Cordelia was doing for most of the series.
Yeah, I think it's very much a Spike character. That's what I thought as well. I was watching it. Yeah, someone who provides the kind of sardonic relief.
And I'm forced to be here and cooperate with these people for reasons somewhat against my will.
So she's also a bit of the Doctor character in that she's clearly more intelligent than the other characters and sometimes feels a bit demeaned or annoyed by having to slow down to stupid people's pace.
And speaking of the Doctor, I always love seeing it, Peter Capaldi in the part, but I don't know if his guest bits at the end entirely worked for me, to be honest. He felt a bit... Even though it's his sort of a show in his universe that depends on him a bit, he felt weirdly out of place.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like they had to bring him in because it was always incredibly awkward and Torchwood that he never appeared, or actually on the screen. There was many times when I was watching Torchwood where I was just like, why doesn't the Doctor just turn up and fix this?
Please, someone with some charisma, please.
Yeah, kind of. But yeah, so it was kind of good that they got that out of the way, so we won't have this lingering shadow of why won't the Doctor just turn up throughout the whole series.
Because he's delegated to a bunch of kids.
Yeah, because, he has officially delegated to them, and he's tried to boost their egos to make them feel like they can deal with all this weird stuff that's going to happen to them.
I know there are behind-the-scenes reasons why this couldn't happen, but part of me feels like it would have been better if they delegated Clara to this show, and her going, oh, there's some evil here, I better fight it, and the Doctor saying, there's some evil here, Clara's going to fight it, would possibly have made more sense than the Doctor going, there's some evil here. You there, you happen to be nearby.
I don't think she would have fit into this show. I think she's too much of a... The best way I can describe this is she's a bit too much like a children's TV show presenter. She's not the right age category of character, if that makes sense. I don't think you could have an adult in this show that's like her. It wouldn't fit the tone.
Yeah, I guess she couldn't really be one of the gang, could she? She'd have to be kept a bit at a distance in some sort of weird supervisor role, and it might have got a bit odd.
Yeah, she's just too earnest.
Miss Quill is older, I suppose, because she's also kind of a bit more like the Giles character in that, and also I guess the Doctor role in that she has the additional knowledge, so to bring context to things, and also so that when they encounter a strange creature, someone who can move the plot along by explaining what it is. Clara is probably a bit too young to be the kind of, the Giles figure, the kind of knowledgeable patriarchal or matriarchal figure for the group, but she's probably not young enough to be the kind of the plucky hero of a YA show.
Is Miss Quill older than Clara? She looks about the same age, or if anything, younger.
I thought she was older.
I thought she was older. But that may just be part of her character. She's not exactly a carefree type of character.
Well, yeah, she's not earnest and optimistic and let's go get 'em, guys. No, which I guess Clara probably would have been in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. I think that Miss Quill is a much better fit for the show from that point of view. As a kind of wry, tired adult rather than the earnest, let's go fix this.
Yeah, it would have made it a slightly easier to smoothly transition into the status quo, I guess, but it probably wouldn't have. You're right, it probably wouldn't have worked that well as part of it.
I could see Clara if they did a different spin-off for a younger audience.
But she's off playing Queen Victoria, so never mind.
Yeah.
For the record, Catherine Kelly is 7 years older than Jenna Louise Coleman.
Okay, fair enough.
There you go, Alastair and I win.
Destroyed again. But yeah, I must admit though, the first episode, although the weakness of it was partly the need to shovel on the exposition at this level of sci-fi that seems quite a bit out of place. Also, the dialogue seemed weirdly clunky. It seemed like the second episode, I'm sure the first episode, there was quite a lot of times where they sort of did a joke or did a bit of clever dialogue, and I was more sort of, oh, I see what you did there, or a bit of an eye roll, rather than actually laughing or being entertained by it. Whereas the second episode, I think, really did go along quite smoothly.
I think it's to do with the characters. The characters are all quite tropey. I think that they don't appear that way so obviously because the cast is quite diverse, which is, if you weren't seeing diversity as a good thing on its own merits, the fact that it can make old tropes seem fresher should also bring you over to the cause of yay diversity. Does that sentence make sense? I hope so.
If not, I'll just cut it.
So I think in the first episode, because all the characters are quite tropey, you've got that unpopular girl, you've got the brainy girl, you've got the jock character, you've got the posh guy who's actually an alien. So,
that well-known standard.
He's the outsider.
He's the outsider, and the fact that he is actually an alien is a nice play on that. And because they are all quite tropey and they are very much in their boxes at the start, I think that does kind of influence the dialogue and make it more clunky, because you're like, oh yeah, I know what this character is. She's the one who's really good at all the school things, and he's the guy who's not so good at the school things, but is good at playing football.
But I felt like they could have tried to undercut that more immediately. Like, you had the girl who was quite nice and quite good at school things, and most of her dialogue was very, hi, I'm the girl who's nice and good at school things. It's so hard being nice. I wish people would just see me as kind or something. I don't know. They could have worked harder to get into it in the first episode, maybe, or at least just written better jokes.
Yeah, there were moments when they...
Well, I guess they could have... Sorry. If they had kept us at more of a distance from the characters, then we wouldn't have known about their tropey aspects until later on. But then we wouldn't have had the same emotional connection had they not showed us what these characters were like.
I think the tropey stuff works quite well in the first 10-15 minutes of your show, when you're trying to get people to, work out who the main characters are quite early and, go along with the plot. I felt like they hadn't really subversed it much by the end of the first episode. It didn't really happen till the second episode.
Yeah.
There's a dynamic between Ram, the sort of aspiring footballer, and his father, which I think is quite interesting. There's a dynamic between April, the Sophie Hopkins character, and her mother, who's been in a car accident, is now in a wheelchair. So they add some extra levels to the characters. Charlie, the prince, is also gay, and they introduced a love interest for him who's from an Eastern European family. So
what's up with that kid? Mateus. He got to be in the sort of the Doctor's explanatory group shot, which creates the vague illusion that he might be part of the gang. And then in the second episode, he's busy or sick or something.
Bear in mind the fact that the second episode focused very much on Ram.
Ram and Tanya, yeah.
Yeah, who knows, in a future episode that may be more focused on Charlie, he might come back. They might have decided, or overcomplicate things. Because they do have quite a lot of characters to juggle.
It's true. I just thought I was sort of wondering if Mateus was going to be the sort of the guy who looks like he's going to be part of the gang, then dies in episode 3 or something. We'll see, I suppose.
Well, it's on the cards.
But yeah, going back to what Alastair was saying about Ram's dad, actually, I quite liked the bit where Ram actually told his dad what was going on at the end of the second episode. That was a fun bit of subversion of my inevitable expectations.
Yeah, that almost never happens. But his dad took it quite calmly.
Well, yeah, but again, I guess a bit of subversion. And yeah, that was fun. That's one of the many reasons why I thought the second episode was massively better.
Yeah.
I think the second episode was better because, like I said, it added much more detail to the characters. And I think it's good that first episode they introduced the whole cast, and the second one we chose one, maybe two characters. We'll expand them a bit more. So we'd rather try and just flesh out everyone, because it means we can get a real detailed understanding of these characters, bring them to life a bit more, and make them seem less like, you say, like the sort of school tropes that we're used to, and more like real people.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just kind of thought maybe they could have done something a bit more schooly and down to earth in the first episode to get into it a bit more. I mean, it's a better way round than Torchwood, which had actually quite a good pilot. Certainly by pilot standards, it was quite good. And then the second episode was a complete car crash.
The second episode was the sex alien, and that was
the
terrible.
sex alien.
Yeah, the alien is a sexually transmitted disease. Yes.
Right, we're making an adult show. Let's put some sex in it as soon as possible. Alien.
In fairness to Torchwood, for once, the Buffy adult spin-off Angel also did the sex alien in the second episode. They just did it much better.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, clearly to an extent, it's a bit of, maybe it's the thing to do to show you're an adult show, but the trick is not to massively fuck it up.
Going back to all the Buffy references, I've read that this was actually supposed to be like Buffy. That was very much a deliberate
Mission
idea.
accomplished, guys.
I'm a massive Buffy fan. I have seen the first episode of Buffy probably at least a dozen times because I wrote an essay on it in first year of university. That was a lot more subtle and obviously polished, but I don't think this did a bad job.
The first episode of Buffy, I remember thinking is one of the weaker episodes of Buffy as well, but it established everything fair enough.
It's a very good first episode, as first episodes go.
Well, yeah.
It's not one of the stronger episodes of Buffy, just because it's the first episode.
I mean, to be fair, the whole first season of Buffy isn't the strongest bit of Buffy.
It's like I said at the top, that first episodes just generally have these problems in that it's, there's just so much to set up, which is why, like I say, longer first episodes or like double part first episodes tend to work better.
Buffy did have a double-sized first episode, didn't it? Or it was a two-parter or something?
It was a two-parter.
Yeah. But I guess the temptation is to get your, the big villain you want to use in at the start, so they're part of the character's origins. Yeah, I don't think I'm being controversial in saying the Shadow Kin will probably be back, probably at the end of the series.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess the trouble with that is you end up going into quite spacey sci-fi quite early on, when a lot of the series, I'm assuming, I mean, I might be wrong, maybe the second episode was a one-off, but it seems like a lot of the series is going to be more sort of high school metaphor stuff, especially considering that I doubt they have that much money.
Yeah.
I'm impressed they got the Shadow Kid in one episode and dragons in the second, to be honest.
It's going to be interesting to see how it goes with the big bad. I can't help thinking of Sarah Jane Adventures and its replacement, although not related to Doctor Who, Wizards vs. Aliens, because they did have the evil hanging over for a lot longer.
Did Sarah Jane Adventures have a big bad?
I feel like it did.
I mean, Wizards vs. Aliens obviously had the aliens and the sort of comedy rubber alien face played by Brian Blessed.
And they were in every single episode.
Yeah, they were like proper Rita Repulsa in Power Rangers in every episode, just sending people to fight them type way.
Yeah.
But Sarah Jane Adventures, they barely even had a season arc, did they? It looked like they were going to have a season arc in the last season, but then it was all sort of tragically cut short by Elizabeth Sladen dying.
I think because it was pitched at a much younger audience.
Well, there is that.
I mean, I don't know if when you get, because it was a children's TV show, as in like, the actual children's TV brand. And I don't know if they have a different approach, like they don't go for arc plots at all because younger kids don't follow them, or if younger kids drop in and out of shows much more, so therefore they will struggle with an arc plot.
Yeah, I remember they announced somewhere, well, there was a release or a press release or something, that this was technically pitched at an older audience than Doctor Who, which is one of those things that looks odd when you first read it, but then you sort of think, actually, Doctor Who is aimed at, like, everyone, like kids and stuff as well, whereas this is very much a show aimed at the sort of Y18 audience and up.
Yeah.
He says, justifying his own watching it.
It definitely is. It's full of gore.
It is, it is really gory, actually. Yeah, one thing I was surprised, and actually, I quite liked. I really worried that it would be a bit too, I don't know, they would soften the edges and like that. But no, it's properly gory in places.
Yes, blood.
Ram managed to get covered in blood in the first and the second episode.
Yeah, I did enjoy the ketchup, actually. I don't know if that's going to become a running joke. Oh, look, Ram's been covered in fake blood again. And I think someone said bullshit once, just to really hammer it home.
Yeah.
Well, if Ram does end up being covered in blood a lot, then at least his dad knows, so he won't be going, like, why is there more blood stains on your clothes? Why am I continuously doing this?
I mean, realistically, if it starts happening regularly, his dad might start to just find it a bit worrying.
Yeah.
Isn't it someone else's turn soon?
Yeah.
But yeah, and also on the Buffy comparisons, they killed off the nice headmaster.
Yes, they did.
Oh, yeah.
Can the nasty one be far behind?
Yeah, I imagine that there'd be another robot or he'll be in some way connected to these mysterious governors.
The governors. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's something they're saving for the arc plot as well.
I'd be interested to see where they go, but I'm getting the impression that they might be like a double arc plot where they have the governors and they also have the Shadowkin.
It's only 8 episodes, so they get together somehow. But yeah, maybe Mrs. Quill will just get promoted to head teacher, who knows? But probably not.
Yeah, it seems unlikely. Unless she somehow manages to unless all the alien robots want her and have sex with her. But that might be a bit far, even for this show.
Was it left ambiguous whether Miss Quill was being recruited by the robots or seduced by the robots? I didn't think it was ever made explicit.
Yeah, she interpreted it as seduced, but,
She seemed quite up for the seduction, but I never sure if we entirely worked out what the robot wanted.
Well, he got not really eaten, but chewed up by the dragon pretty quickly.
Yeah, the sheer sort of pulpy silliness of this dragon just crawling over this man's arse with dripping fangs did make me happy. That was just ridiculous. So yeah, if I can keep going in that level, I'll be happy. I mean, there's only 6 episodes to go anyway, so...
It was interesting they brought Peter Capaldi in for the first one for the setup, and it was good to see him, but I do feel that the show has to be able to stand on its own. And as nice as it was to see Capaldi playing Doctor Who this year, I am concerned that, okay, that was good, but now you have to, create a show that's, independent.
I think it's pretty safe to bet that he's probably either gone for the rest of the series or at least gone till the finale at this point. I mean, I don't know whether they've got some other sort of minor character cameo lined up, but this doesn't seem like quite a sort of show where you can just be excited because they brought in some companion from the 70s. That seemed to work a bit better in Sarah Jane Adventures, but it seems like this would be quite odd if they just go, oh look, it's Joe Grant. Cool.
Yeah, I hope they don't bring him back, because you'd hope by the finale that they will have developed the characters enough that they'll be able to stand on their own and they won't need to have a Deus Ex Doctor kind of thing happen where he comes in and saves everything.
He did kind of save the day more or less single-handedly, which... I don't know, I mean, I guess ultimately considering they've only just discovered aliens exist or whatever. But I've kind of lost track of what the status quo is with the public knowing aliens exist on Doctor Who. I know there was a point during the Russell T Davies run where everyone basically just knew.
I think that got erased in the first Matt Smith season when the crack.
There was certainly some stuff during the Stephen Moffat run that heavily implied that was being walked back, but I never worked out if they actually did it.
Yeah.
Keeping track of the Doctor Who meta timeline is a quick route to madness. Just accept whatever they're telling you right now. I thought even though they had Capaldi coming in and saving the day in the first episode, each of the characters got their own little moment. Tanya had the idea of turning on all the lights, and Ram, saved April by hitting the King of the Shadows with a chair. So, I mean, they all had their little moments to to excel, despite the fact it was, the Doctor saving the day as usual.
Yeah, and I think April and the other one, Charlie, will probably get more to do in the next one, particularly when we're just getting to know the characters. I can get on board with the idea of breaking it down a bit and focusing on them 1 or 2 at a time.
Going back to the does the world know that aliens exist thing, for an actual Patrick Ness reference, in his book, The Rest of Us Just Live Here, which is about all the people who are on the sidelines while the chosen ones are fighting the evil. They kind of explain this by just everybody's in a large state of denial. So all the teenagers are like, but this all happened to the adults. We know that this happened to the adults, and yet they pretend nothing's going on.
That was basically something someone said in class, wasn't it?
Yeah.
One of the kids said to the other one, I think at the start of the second episode, did they not see all the aliens yesterday? And the other one's like, people just sort of ignore it and forget. It's weird.
Yeah.
They have some quite knowing dialogue in class, and sometimes it does go down quite well, and sometimes it can miss the mark a bit. I mean, there are moments when the characters talk like they are characters in a TV show and are aware that they're in a TV show.
Yeah.
It gets a bit Rosencrantz and Guilderson are dead at some points. I think in the first episode, there's a bit when Tanya and April are talking, and they just go oh, we just failed the Bechdel test. I like the Bechdel test, and it's an interesting thing, but it's a bit at that point, I was like, wait a minute, are you aware that your character's in a TV show? Because would anyone in real life ever say, would any 2 people in real life ever talk like that?
Having read a fair bit of Tumblr, I can believe that a certain subset of internet and pop culture savvy teenager might say that, but I don't know if they really pulled the line off in that instance.
Yeah, I can imagine, I might say it if I'd walked into a room with a friend and then we just had a conversation that was entirely about men for 10 minutes. Then we might say, oh God, we've just failed the Bechdel test. Let's talk about something else. But they've literally just like walked into school and seen each other, so it doesn't work so well.
Yeah, do those two even know each other that well at that point? I don't know. I mean, Tanya is sort of played as a bit rambling and awkward, I guess, but so probably not entirely out of character. It just, for some reason, clunked a bit when I was watching the episode.
Yeah.
And so as someone who's read a lot of YA, certainly a lot more than either of us probably put together, was this good YA fiction, or was it just a Doctor Who spin-off with sprinklings of it?
It's quite hard to judge at this early stage. It did have what I suspect are some references to YA fiction in it, and it does have a good balance of characters. Like I said before, there's the tropes, but the diversity of the characters kind of offsets that a bit. But it hasn't really delved into any deep issues yet. I mean, you've got Ram's issues with the loss of his leg and worried about his future playing football and his place in the world, but that looks kind of like that's been resolved because now the leg works.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. There's obviously some other issues characters are having with their kind of adjustment to adult life. I mean, that's the main preoccupation of YA literature is characters, or it should be, characters adjusting to adult life or adjusting to the idea that they will have an adult life pretty soon. I liked Tanya's issues with her overbearing mother, although she got out of them quite easily, despite the fact that her mum was so strict. She managed to sneak out.
She does talk about it a lot. She always does a line to say that her mum's quite strict, but it never seems to actually stop her.
Yeah, she's still she hasn't taken her phone away or anything, and she still manages to sneak out of the house and not get caught. But I assume they will go into this in more detail in a later episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, and April's just general issues of popularity. It does tick a lot of the YA boxes.
I mean, I guess in terms of adjusting to adulthood, they've kind of had adulthood or a degree of adult responsibility thrust upon them by the Doctor, by just turning up and going, you've got your time travel hellmouth, deal with that, I'm off.
Yeah, you've got to save the world now,
yeah.
Or at least your corner of it.
But yeah, no, pretty good. I would say so far, based on 2 episodes, better than Torchwood, not yet as good as Sarah Jane Adventures.
I would definitely agree that it's better than Torchwood.
Yeah. As long as they don't suddenly retcon a character that was supposed to be awful into a guy you're supposed to sympathise with, then they'll have beaten Torchwood in my eyes.
Torchwood's really getting a bit of a pounding at the moment. Because I think it's its 10th anniversary, I keep seeing interviews going, Torchwood might come back, or Torchwood is bubbling under during the 10th anniversary. It's like, Torchwood's bubbling under? That's a threat. Shut up.
I did see a John Barrowman thing, did he saying Torchwood is definitely dead and not coming back?
I mean, I liked Children of Earth. Children of Earth was genuinely excellent. It's just a shame about basically most of the rest of it.
It's the whole they tried to break America and it didn't really work thing. I was like, did you guys learn nothing from one of those pop stars who tried to break America and then disappeared?
I know. I'm assuming they're not going to resolve any of the storylines for Miracle Day at this point, because they brought in 2 new American actors, the bloke from ER, I think, and the woman from 6 Feet Under.
Yeah, they have Mekhi Phifer and Lauren Ambrose.
Those 2. Sort of set them up to be, important, and I'm guessing they probably never get them back. But to be fair, I'm sure Torchwood fan base just want to see Jack, Gwen, and for them to bring Yanto back from the dead, and they'll basically be happy. Especially Yanto.
Yeah, especially Yanto.
Okay, so that was class. We've got another 6 episodes. I imagine we'll maybe take another look at that when it's finished, or at least cover it in our no doubt amazing 2016 recap episode we'll probably be doing. So, Julianne, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
That's okay. It's been fun. Do you have any web things you want to plug?
I do, but there are so many of them. I think you'll just have to put all my links in the show notes. I have many internet projects. I have a booktube channel, a collab booktube channel, a book blog, a lifestyle blog, and I tweet and Instagram quite a lot as well.
Okay, I'll try and fit that into the show notes. It'll probably be longer than the rest of the show notes. So. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Next, we will be discussing I, Daniel Blake, Ken Loach's Palme d'Or winning social realist drama. Dan has a heart attack, and his doctor says he cannot continue working as a carpenter. He tries to claim benefits, unemployment and job seekers allowance. However, he soon encounters how sort of difficult this is and sort of the problems with the benefit system and how restricted it is. He also meets a young mum, Katie, and her 2 children who are in a similar circumstance. And what you get is a heartfelt sort of plea for some humanity for poor people living in Newcastle, or just poor people generally. Ken Loach is a very political filmmaker. He usually tries to make a political point. This film, more than most, is a clearly crusading film trying to make a specific point that the benefit system is harsh and cruel, and good, honest people who just want to live like Katie and Daniel Blake, are just completely crapped on by the system. It's very much in Ken Loach's direct, very political style. We went to see it recently. Nick, what did you think?
Man, that was the bleakest episode of EastEnders ever. Actually, I lie, I've seen some EastEnders and it's often bleaker than that, but still. Yeah. It's hard for me to really criticise in detail, as it's very worthy and clearly trying to make a point that it badly cares about, but I did feel it kind of focused on making that point to the slight detriment of, I don't know, is entertainment value the right word?
The story or the character?
Probably the story, certainly. The characters were fairly well defined, but I didn't feel it really went into them much or interrogated them much. Like, there's not really an effort to put across both sides of an argument here, but I guess if your opponent is the bureaucratic evilness of the benefit system, I don't quite know who would put across the other side of it. But it's got a point. It makes the point. It makes the point, fairly clearly and well in about the first 10-15 minutes. And not a huge amount actually happens for the rest of the film. I mean, I could have guessed the ending from pretty early on. And yeah, the acting was very good. It was quite sort of starkly and plainly shot. It was sort of thing where if it was a documentary, I'd sort of feel it would seem like fair enough, real life is actually like this. But considering it's an actual film which someone has written a script for, I was a bit sort of, could you not have added more incidents or a twist or a bit more moral conflict somewhere? But yeah, there were a couple of bits which sort of bordered on it. But yeah, I don't know, it was alright. It was well enough made for what it was, but what it was didn't massively interest me.
I guess social realism as a sort of filmmaking movement, what you just described is quite typical of their films, in that there's a lot of character usually. The plot's usually quite secondary. It's very much these people in their circumstances. This film more so is really, because it's really trying to make a point, kind of, which is the overriding factor of this film. There's kind of two ways you can talk about it, and one is obviously, I completely agree with the political point this film is trying to make, that the benefit system is quite cruel. It's completely not providing the lifeline for the people who can't work and really need it.
Absolutely, yes. I'm not saying I disagree with that, just to be clear.
No, exactly, yeah. But the one thing I kind of, even though this has a strong political message, I really want to talk about this as a film rather than the politics of it. So I think that's probably the last we'll kind of say on that, in that, I do have a politics blog, which I'll plug at the end of the episode, and if you want to read about the politics of Daniel Blake, you can go there. But I kind of want to make the point, like, how good is this at conveying its point, being as politically neutral as possible? And one of the few points I would make, that it is light on plot. The film is really kind of like a series of vignettes, interconnected kind of sort of scenes that kind of build this kind of point, rather than a kind of having a strong plot thread running through it.
I'd kind of argue that they less build the point and more repeat the point, but fair point.
So yeah, you get, as you said, kind of from the first scene, kind of as soon as the credits start, you kind of get the kind of the point it's trying to make. I thought the characterization was very strong. There's some really good bits, like there's a scene when Dan's talking to Katie and her children about his wife who passed away, and just through a few kind of subtle lines of dialogue, you do really get a strong sense of who his wife was who died and what their life was together.
Yeah, I'd honestly almost have rather watched a film focusing on really digging into Daniel as a character and talking more about his relationship with his wife, but because it clearly wanted to make sure it didn't not talk about benefits for more than 5 minutes at a time, you never really got into that.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a similar thing with this similar scene with Katie, when again only through a few lines of dialogue she fills in her backstory. And like it's very classic Ken Loach in that, you've got these really detailed characters, they're very realistic people. He really conveys straight away that yes, these are, I know people like this. They're real people with real lives. They're relatable and stuff. They're very much kind of kitchen sink drama that we are seeing into people's lives. Like you're saying, like kind of like EastEnders, but a bit less melodramatic than EastEnders.
Yeah, but I don't know if more melodrama is the answer. I think perhaps making it a more rounded portrayal of Daniel as a whole, rather than every scene being an engine to make a similar point about benefits, would have been better.
Yeah,
I would obviously, I don't know. I mean, obviously Ken Loach is a very experienced director who's been working for a long time, even though I predictably haven't seen any of his films. Obviously, it's not really my place to tell him what he should or shouldn't do, but I don't know, what he clearly wants to do with this film isn't really my bag.
Yeah, and it's very much, like I say, it's a crusading film. And it does make its point. I think it's effective in making its points, because that's kind of, it's here to do one thing and it does that well. It shows the unjust nature of the benefit system. It shows how it lacks humanity. It shows how kind of, the poor are, left behind by our system. One of the points I think it makes really well is that in this film, all the people are very nice and very helpful, but it's the system that is the kind of the problem that's grinding people down.
Really? Because out of the 3 job centre employees, 2 of them are portrayed as twats.
I guess so, but I guess they're kind of portrayed as the system makes them that way. And there's one sympathetic job centre employee who tries to help Dan as much as possible, but the system kind of prevents her doing that.
Yeah, twats may have been a strong word, but there are two of them who are definitely portrayed as fairly jobsworthy and unfeeling. They're just doing their job without really caring that much about the people it affects.
Definitely. And also there's a bit when Kate she's obviously struggling, so she shoplifts and she gets caught, and the shop manager takes pity on her. He could have called the police, but he decides to let her go because she can see she's shoplifting out of because she's poor and she can't generally afford food. Like Daniel's neighbours are this kind of, I guess, young 20-somethings who kind of they've got some sort of dodgy thing going on selling trailers, but you get a sense that everyone's a nice person and everyone kind of wants what's best. It's just the system is geared against any kind of acknowledgement of humanity or justice. It's just the system just grinds people down. Yeah,
it did have a sort of nice range of 3 or 4 characters from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds who would probably normally be portrayed in a fairly stereotypical way, and it does skirt around that. Although I was kind of disappointed when... Sorry guys, spoilers. This is your chance to stop listening. Spoilers are happening now. I was kind of disappointed when Katie turned to escorting. I don't know why. Maybe just because it seemed like such an obvious twist.
Yeah, I thought that felt very much I kind of saw that coming, and I felt like we need something, generally gritty and unpleasant to put in to get across about how bad the situation is.
I've made my EastEnders jokes. That was almost a bit too EastEnders, to be honest.
Yeah.
And also, actually, in that same storyline, there's a bit, even bigger spoilers coming in a second, where, towards the end of the film, where Daniel finds out that Casey's been escorting by a string of coincidences, and then goes to her place of escort, work, whatever, and confronts her about it. And I was like, you're actually being a bit of a prick, Daniel. You didn't need to barge in on her there like this.
Yeah.
You could have just spoken to her at home. I mean, it probably still wouldn't have gone that well, but the way you've chosen to do it actually isn't very nice.
No, I agree with that.
And, I did wonder if this was going to be the moment where we get some character interrogation of Daniel, but it's not really followed up on. Then it just goes returns to its central point, and then the film ends.
So you're going to say there was a bit when maybe it was a bit too EastEnders, and a bit too much kind of we need to get one bit in that's kind of quite gritty and awful, rather than the slow breaking down of someone under poverty doesn't really lend itself to being filmed that easily. We just need to put in one moment of something bad happening.
There's a bit where she's going, Katie, the young mum he befriends, the one who later turns to escorting, is going around a food bank and has a sort of mini breakdown. And that's really good and really affecting. That was a good conveyal of the message. That was a nice little moment, which was a lot less melodramatic than the later escort thing.
Yeah, I thought that was a very good...
That was one of the best bits of the whole film.
Yeah, and also it shows how long they have to queue to get into a food bank and all this stuff, and that it makes a point of a kind of the wider social points about the film's trying to make about how there's a lot of poverty and a lot of people are struggling. It's not just Daniel and Katie. It's kind of the system is failing people. I mean, there's a bit when Daniel's sent to a CV workshop. Yeah. Kind of against his will because he needs to work on his CV to get another job. And that scene kind of makes the point very much that there just aren't enough jobs for the people who are searching for them. Even if Daniel made a brilliant CV, it doesn't matter. So there are moments like that when it brings in kind of wider political points. But I think you're right. That kind of some of the best bit was Katie having her breakdown in the food bank. Partly because, again, everyone in the food bank is very nice, and I think she's just not used to people being nice and helpful to her. She finds it hard to accept help. She wants to maintain her pride because it's one of the few things she's got left. Yeah, I mean,
I follow a lot of reasonably sort of liberal people on Twitter, such as yourself, and occasionally I get articles about, what the benefit system is like and stuff, retweeted, and then I sometimes read them, and I had a vague idea that, things like being forced to go to CV workshops are things that happen. So, I don't know, I mean, if this is meant to be a film to hammer home how bad it is, maybe it would be more illuminating to someone who didn't necessarily read around that so much, I don't know. But then again, I don't know if that person would go and see this film.
Yeah, that's brings us neatly to my biggest issue with the film, which is that though this film is very effective at making a very important political point and is very good in that regard, I'm really worried it will only be seen by people who already agree with it. I mean, we were watching it in Walthamstow, in East London. It's a liberal area, safe Labour seat, all that sort of thing. And there was a bit like in the film when one character has a rant about Tories and Ian Duncan Smith and stuff, and everyone in the cinema cheered. And it's nice to be surrounded by people who agree with you, who like it when the Tories get insulted on the cinema. But I'm worried this is not really going to reach out to those crucial swing voters or the sort of people who aren't already susceptible to the message.
Well, exactly, because as I said at the start, and I think have said since, it doesn't really have a compelling enough story to do that. I mean, I don't know who I'd recommend this to be honest. I mean, I think people who do vehemently disagree with it will probably find it annoying.
One of the things I was thinking about this film in that line is that it kind of really wants to be like a modern day Cathy Come Home, which for those who don't know, Cathy Come Home was a BBC TV drama that I believe was on TV in 1966. It might have been 1965. But anyway, and it was about the state of housing in the UK. And it was this really hard-hitting emotional drama about this poor woman and the horrible kind of housing situations. And it did lead to political change. Cathy Come Home convinced lots of people that we need to do something about housing in the UK. The conditions are just terrible. And I think this film is trying to do that with Benefits, trying to hit across to people that we need to change something because the situation is just terrible. The only difference is Cathy Come Home was on BBC in the late 1960s. There were only two channels. It was like BBC and independent television.
Yeah.
You had to, if you wanted to watch TV that night, you pretty much had to watch Cathy Come Home. It reached huge numbers of people who were unaware of this issue or people who kind of believed the opposite, and it managed to change their minds kind of because you kind of had to watch it, and it was this enormous event. The problem with media now is because we've got so much choice, and don't get me wrong, choice is a great thing. I love Netflix and Amazon Prime and all the cable channels and the sheer variety of programming that's available. The problem is if you make something like I, Daniel Blake, it will find an audience of people who are already agree to the idea. It's really hard to be another Cathy Come Home.
Well, that's what people mean when they talk about, the increasing siloing or splitting off of pop culture. People increasingly will watch things that are made by people they really like or recommended by their friends who they broadly agree with. Or
yeah, exactly.
I think the only way to get something like this in front of a lot of people was for it to be more compelling or more challenging in some way, and because it's such a one-sided and not that story-driven portrayal of one issue, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And the film is clearly all about the benefit system, so I don't see its appeal broadening to people who basically aren't already politically sympathetic to it. Maybe if this film wins loads and loads of BAFTAs next year, the right-wing press will have to comment on it. I'm sure it's going to get an amazing write-up in The Guardian.
I can confirm that I am looking at the write-up in The Guardian, and it's pretty glowing, yeah. They've conceded it's flawed, but they're still giving it 4 stars. Which
I think is fair. I mean, it's a film trying to do one thing, and it does that one thing well.
Yeah, it does it without any flourishes. It was like we were talking about, what was it, Julieta a few episodes ago. And that told a very sort of plain day-to-day story, albeit day-to-day in Spain, so not quite as relentlessly grey as the East Midlands. But it did throw in a lot more sort of comparatively sort of directorial flourishes with sort of cool shots or out-of-sequence storytelling, whereas this is very stark.
Yeah, it's going to appeal to Ken Loach fans and people who are sympathetic to the message.
If the new Ken Loach film doesn't appeal to Ken Loach fans, then something's gone wrong.
Good point, well made.
Yeah, I mean, you can't argue this is incompetent. I mean, the guy playing Daniel Blake was really good. I mean, the bits where he did get to do some detailed characterisation were good. He did, considering a lot of his scenes were him playing a similar beat of frustration at the benefit system. He did manage to sort of demonstrate this sort of increasing frustration and increasing sort of dignified weariness, rather than making it seem samey.
Yeah, and I thought Hayley Squires as Katie was really, really good. She really nailed that character, someone who's single mum, desperately trying to hold her family together. She's from London, but the only place you can get a council house is Newcastle, so she's been moved up north. She's lost and alone, struggling to get by, trying to hold on to as much pride as she can. And I thought, she really brought that character to life, made her completely believable, and she was good.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. It's not really my place to say this was garbage, man, but it didn't float my personal boat. We'll see. I mean, quite possibly in a year's time it'll have won 20 BAFTAs and be viewed as a revelatory piece that shone a light upon our broken welfare system, and we'll just look like fools. Who knows?
We'll let you know when that happens.
Our best of 2017 roundup will include our total humiliation at the success of Daniel Blake.
Yeah, well, I hope it's successful, and I would love it to win loads of BAFTAs and it to reach a much wider audience. I think the thing is because Ken Loach, because he directed Cathy Come Home, and it had a huge impact, and he's trying to recreate that with I, Daniel Blake, and he's done very well, and really conveys his message well, and his film has powerful emotional impacts. But the world has moved on from Cathy Come Home. What worked in the 60s for Cathy Come Home, I'm worried won't work in the 2010s for I, Daniel Blake.
Yeah.
I wish I'd remembered earlier that when I was talking about Cathy Come Home for the first time, that of course it's the same director, isn't it?
Okay, and lastly this fortnight, we will be talking about Rick and Morty, the animated series from Adult Swim, which I recommended to Alastair last week. This is a sort of anarchic science fiction comedy, which is sort of a loose play on Back to the Future, I guess, in that there's a mad scientist called Rick and his grandson, Morty, who he then drags into a string of bizarre science fiction concepts, which are pretty much entirely played for grim laughs. And this is created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, who's also best known for creating Community. And yeah, I watched it actually only a month or so ago because it was put up on Netflix, and I just thought it was really good and wanted to talk about it on the podcast. So I decided to blow one of my recommendation slots on it. Alastair, was it worth it?
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed watching it, is the short version. When I started watching it first, I was like, initially I wasn't sure what to make of it. Like, it's really crude in places. It's got quite a scattergun first episode. And also, over years of watching Family Guy and really coming to quite passionately dislike Family Guy, I do have a sort of sensitivity to cartoons that try to be shocking just for the sake of shocking. But then as I watched it, I realised this show was completely not like that. It has a really good, very sort of clever, self-aware sense of humour. It's not like one of those shows that just like, I'm just going to throw out something that's crude and shocking just because like, the funniest thing is to go as low as you can. I mean, it does have a very crude sense of humour, but it has like much more to it. There is like, quite a lot going on there. So after a kind of 3 or 4 episodes, I was like, no, I really get what this show's trying to do and the way it's trying to sort of subversing science fiction tropes or like kind of established archetypes of the science fiction genre. So yeah, I did really, really like it. I thought it had some really good plots. It's either been funny, just the general sci-fi plot nature of the shows were like really interesting. There's a really good one when Rick and Morty get trapped in a simulation by some aliens, and then they escape the simulation, but then they realize there's a simulation within the simulation, and then there's like another simulation within that, and it is quite clever how the sort of plot is sort of structured, playing with that, again, sci-fi trope of simulations within simulations that turns up in a few sci-fi things.
Did you spot that episode was called M. Night Shyamalan Aliens?
Yeah, I saw that, yeah.
So yeah, clearly they're mostly just ripping the piss out of like that sort of twist, it was a simulation all along type storytelling.
Yeah, exactly. I really like I think it was possibly the 4th episode or 5th episode with the Mr. Meeseeks.
Miss Meeseeks, yeah, that was great.
Yeah, that's really funny when Rick gives to Morty's parents this box, and you press a button and it creates this being called a Mr. Meeseeks. You give them one task and their existence is just purely to fulfill that task and then disappear, and that's the only thing they crave. And it's just, you have to see it. It's really cleverly written and very funny science fiction, yeah.
I mean, you were talking about animated shows that do focus largely on, lol, here's a bum, or something for the comedy. Like, basically just we've said something slightly shocking. But I think where Rick and Morty slightly differs from that is I think there's a sort of a genuine, quite grim nihilism in there, which they do sort of actually commit to and weave through all the plots, like the Meeseeks and their hatred of existing. Or did you watch episode 6?
The Cronenbergs, yeah.
Yeah, that went to some dark places.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one when they release a virus that makes the whole world fall in love with Morty. And then in order to fix it, he keeps creating worse and worse viruses. And you can tell that like Morty is like absolutely horrified and quite psychologically scarred by this experience. And Rick's very much just like, best not to think about it, just get on with it. And you're right, the strength of the show is this very nihilistic, very grim humour. And it's not just shocking for the sake of shocking, like Family Guy, like let's just throw out some rape and paedophile jokes with no thought of like the audience. We'll just do it because like, oh, we went there. Whereas Rick and Morty, it's like they've studied the kind of specifically how dark and grim they want their humour to be, and they do kind of really hit that note.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not that it has, no anchoring whatsoever. As I say, it's very much clear that what happens in that Cronenberg episode does deeply scar Morty. It is visibly enough empathy and humanity for it not to just be gibberish. Like, all the characters are, consistent and in character and sort of likeable to a degree.
Yeah.
Or at least watchable and relatable. Which, yeah, does, I think, stop the overpowering nihilism of it all, turning it into something that's just depressing to watch.
Yeah. There is a very crude sense of humour to it, which I do like. I like crude humour when it's done well. Like they have the main character, or one of the at least 2 main characters, Morty, is a teenager, and there's a lot of teenagers being teenage, and teenagers, especially teenage boys, are quite crude. There is a lot of boob jokes and stuff because, when you're 16, you spend a significant portion of your existence thinking about boobs. So they do hit that. Sometimes it goes over into, like, there are a lot of jokes about sexually objectifying women, and there really aren't that many developed female characters in it. I don't know if that's, like, a clever play on the fact that, like, this is how teenage boys think, and it is, like, they do just objectify women without really considering it. But there is kind of an element of, whilst you're showing that, you are also doing it at the same time.
Well, your main characters are, a teenage boy and a constantly drunk old man. So
Yeah.
you can see how you get there.
So I think it's an interesting show in that, like, it's one of those perennial issues shows have, which is there's showing what teenagers are actually like, and also in showing what's wrong with the way teenagers think and behave, you are sort of also not necessarily glorifying, but exemplifying.
The gaze is quite critical, though. I think stuff like when the episode where Morty buys that sex robot. I don't know if you've got there yet.
And I didn't see that one, but yeah.
It's coming, but it's not played as particularly pleasant or nice or sexy. It's just grim. And, I think there's a lot of the times when they do bring in Morty obviously perving, it's not played as particularly heroic or pleasant. Vic is the sort of the constantly wisecracking lead character, but he's also quite clearly A, mentally unstable, and B, constantly drunk. So it's not played as particularly heroic or cool.
Yeah, exactly. He's not supposed to be a character you look up to. It really shows that he's just like reckless, self-destructive, has no regard for himself or anyone else, and is also quite egotistical. But it goes to show kind of like that, because part of it, what it's spoofing is, Back to the Future. Obviously, they've got a Morty, and as opposed to a Marty character, and it just shows how kind of Doc Brown is a slightly dodgy guy in Back to the Future. Like,
oh god, my childhood. I didn't see Back to the Future until I was 20, but still.
Yeah, but it basically thinks that like there is something a bit suspect about Doc Brown, and like they kind of take that aspect and like push it to 11 in Rick and Morty. It is like really funny.
And again, this is sort of adjacent to the nihilism, I guess. But there's also they never give in to the temptation to turn them into superheroes, except in like a couple of episodes where it's for a joke. They are clearly just some guys sort of tumbling haplessly through this weird shit.
Yeah,
they're quite insignificant in the face of it. Like they're just sort of trying to avoid dying.
Yeah, and they usually like just mess up all the time, and a lot of the plot is them trying to fix their mess ups. Usually mess ups caused by overconfidence.
And the family subplots, which could easily become the sort of the dull thing you cut away to, are mostly genuinely really good and really funny, I think. I don't think there were many where I thought, oh, it's this again. Fuck off.
Yeah.
The three family members are well-developed and funny and good, and their stuff usually crosses over with the Rick and Morty subplots in a funny way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just really fucking funny. It's just a good show. It's kind of hard to convey humour in this sort of analysis, but yeah, the fact is most of the jokes land, and therefore it's a good, funny animation.
Yeah, continuing the vein of the show being like kind of quite cynical, one of the things I really liked is that Morty's parents, their relationship is clearly failing, and like they're on the verge of like completely collapsing. And it's kind of one of those things that like it's not like the other side of some animated sitcoms like Simpsons or King of the Hill, which always ends on this really warm, like nice moments of family togetherness when like there's no kind of redeeming aspect to this nuclear family. It is just kind of, they all seem quite depressed and unhappy with their family, and it is sort of just slowly disintegrating.
Like, because at the end of a lot of episodes of Simpsons, they realise they love each other and recommit to the family unit. At the end of a lot of episodes of Rick and Morty, at least in the season 1 that I've seen, they sort of go, am I unhappy? Are we just together for the children? Is it time we considered divorce? But then something stupid happens to distract them from this realisation. But yeah, that is at the beat a lot of the family subplots end on.
So yeah, it's kind of subverting some of the tropes of like the animated family sitcom. It's also like subverting a lot of like sci-fi tropes or like famous sci-fi plots. Like I said, there's the human body one when they do basically Jurassic Park. As you mentioned in the last episode, there's a really good Inception one.
Oh god, I forgot about that.
Yeah, when there's like, but it's like much more crazy than the original Inception, and kind of points out that although Inception is a great film, I really like it, it is kind of a bit silly, and it does on some level. There are holes in the plot and stuff.
It's quite on the nose as well, isn't there? A bit where Vic basically lectures Morty going, are you saying this doesn't make sense, Morty? Are you saying this is stupid, Morty? Are you perhaps on some level admitting that everyone's favourite film of the last few years is actually gibberish, Morty?
Yeah, he does do that, yeah.
So yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. I look forward to them sticking season 2 up on Netflix. It's a great show.
My favourite one, though, which they do a sci-fi one, is I think it's the second episode when Rick makes the dog self-aware. They have like a tiny, small, fluffy, yappy dog, and it's basically quite stupid and just pees on the carpet all the time. So Rick gives it a sort of slight intelligence upgrade with a machine, but kind of makes the dog a bit too clever, and it becomes self-aware, and then starts like augmenting its machine to make it more intelligent, and then it starts building like bigger and stronger machine bodies to the point it becomes like quite threatening because it's very intelligent. There's like a brilliant bit when Morty's older sister is called Summer, is she?
Yeah.
She's just lying in bed, and then like the dog comes in, and it's built itself a kind of Metroid-style battlesuit with like missiles on the back. It just comes in and goes, "Where are my testicles, Summer? You took away my testicles. Where are they?" And it's properly threatening. It's just a great take on the kind of Terminator or various other sci-fi ones that do the kind of, you give something intelligence, then it learns much faster than you projected, and it becomes self-aware and then sort of angry. There's some great bits. And it goes like, if your children were born with unnaturally short legs, would you breed them with other children with short legs, as you did to the Dachshund?
And that was sort of the subplot as well, wasn't it? That was sort of going on weirdly in the background when Rick and Morty were doing their Inception thing.
Yeah, there was that, yeah. I thought that one was really good, and I thought the Mr. Mises was like a really clever sci-fi story as well.
Yeah, no, those were two of the highlights. I like that. I mean, I like all of it, to be fair. It's just a good show. But yeah, those one, of the first six, those two and the alternate reality Cronenberg thing, those were good.
Yeah. The other thing I really liked about this show is the animation is like amazing. It's really, really good, considering that the main characters are drawn quite crudely, but the rest of the animation is really, really good. Like the backgrounds and stuff, it's just beautiful, and like the textures are really good, and like it's so colourful and vibrant and detailed. Like there's, in the first episode, they travel to this sort of alternative reality where these mega trees live, and it's just like I don't know. Again, it's really hard to describe unless you see it, but like it's just, there's so many things when they do really good job of just designing these sci-fi worlds and drawing these beautiful, vibrant, colourful backgrounds, like in really brilliant like aliens, and they just look really, just looks really good.
Assuming there's some intentionalness. Good words, Nick. To the fact that the regular people and the regular world is drawn in quite plain, simple animation, and like the main two characters as well. But all the sci-fi stuff is drawn in this incredibly luscious, vibrant style.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely it. And like again, like the one when there's the theme park inside the body, like the animation of all the different diseases and like viruses and stuff they encounter. They just, I don't know, the detail is really good. They spent a lot of time on character design and a lot of time on background animation to make you look really, really lush. And yeah, it's really spectacular. Probably some of the best animation I've seen in a cartoon for ages. It's very, very good.
Yeah, but I like Community as well, which is also from Dan Harmon, but so far, I mean, it's not really a fair comparison considering I've watched 5 seasons of Community and 1 season of Rick and Morty, but so far Rick and Morty actually seems a bit less hit and miss than Community. Pretty much every episode is good or really good.
Yeah. There's a great bit in the first episode, again, which is it's like a background joke. They're trying to escape through this alien spaceport, and it's just, again, brilliantly designed. It's just amazing to detail on all these sort of really bizarre variety of aliens they have in the background. And there's one really strange bit when like Morty knocks over this small glass case involving like a tiny green man, and the green man runs after them, and in the space of about 5 seconds he grows from being a tiny child into an adult, and then ages really rapidly and dies. And it's just one of those like brief background things, and it was basically, there was a moment where, wait, did I just see that? There was that tiny green guy who like lived a whole space of his life in like 5 seconds, and then Morty goes like, well, what was that? And Rick's like, it's best if you don't think about it. And I really like, it's just that tiny like little subtle details like that is what brings a show to life, and this show really nailed all the character design and background animation, and kind of, it was fantastic.
Excellent. Okay, that's a win recommendation for me, I feel. Well done, Nick. Okay, so after the success of Rick and Morty, what's next, Alastair?
Well, we've got another comedy TV show.
Fabulous.
That's also got a kind of grim and sort of slightly cynical outlook on the world. So I feel there's continuity here. However, going from something that's incredibly vibrant and sort of bright to something that's quite contained and grey is my best way to put it. So I'm going to recommend to you Sean Locke's short-lived sitcom 15 Stories High.
Okay.
Yeah, in which Sean Locke shares a small flat with Benedict Wong in a tower block somewhere in London. He lives on the 15th floor, and it's a sort of mix of a sitcom and a sketch show, in that each episode has sort of a sitcom plot involving Sean Locke's and Benedict Wong's character being sort of awkward, mismatched flatmates. but every so often it cuts to other people who live in the building who aren't related to the sitcom plot in any way, but then there's just a little sketch about those characters.
Yeah.
It kind of brings in all the people who live in the building, but like you'll get just a bit like there would just be a weird scene of like a family eating dinner, and you get like a sort of 2-minute sketch, and then it goes back to the main plot, and it's not related in any way. So it kind of got a combination of sketch and sitcom. It's a great show, criminally underrated, I think.
Okay. No, I've heard of it, but I've never seen it, so this is going to be interesting.
Cool.
Okay, that's all your moderate fantasy violence for this week. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Julianne Benford for coming on. And remember, you can follow her on Twitter as @LadyJulianne. We'll put all her links in the show notes. And you can follow us on Twitter as @MFV Podcast. You can also get us on Facebook if you just search for Moderate Fantasy Violence. We also have a YouTube channel which you can subscribe to if you want, where we post our episodes basically playing over a static image. I don't listen to podcasts that way myself, but it's now there for those of you who do.
You can also go to our website, which is www.moderatefantasyviolence.com. On there, you can listen to this episode and all our previous episodes and find the show notes. You can also find a few bonus essays and our excessive fantasy violence audio clips. If you go on the website now, you will find I've posted 3 excessive fantasy violence audio clips detailing all the other films I saw at the London Film Festival. So if you want to find out about films like A Monster Calls, based on the novel by Patrick Ness, or The Stopover, a really interesting French film, go straight to the website. I've been Alastair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at Alastair JR Ball. You can also find my writing at redtrainblog.com. If you go over to the Red Train blog right now, you'll find an article about the politics of I, Daniel Blake. We talked about it as a film in this episode of the podcast, but if you're interested in the political debate surrounding it, then head over to the Red Train blog and you can read my thoughts there.
Okay, I've been Nick Bryant. If you want to find out more about my self-published crime novels, and then you can go to nickbryan.com, or I'm on Twitter as @NickMB. And we'll be back next week when we'll be covering Black Mirror, which is technically out now, but we needed a bit longer to digest it, along with the new major sci-fi film Arrival, the documentary Lo and Behold, and of course 50 Stories High, Alastair's latest recommendation. Okay, see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Better than Torchwood, but to be honest, you don't have to try that hard to be better than Torchwood. Just don't put a sex alien in your second episode.
Well, they've managed that already.
Also, no one takes anyone from Wales seriously.